Hello, and thank you for joining us for a Wednesday episode of Precision Cycle. I received some feedback after Monday's podcast when we spoke about Nancy McWilliams and how we could utilize some of the things that she writes about to help ourselves and our partners going through perimenopause. A lot of the feedback I got was, what does that support actually look like? I've been to therapy. I've been asking therapists and other people. I've tried engaging psychology, self-help, and I still can't find anyone to give me an actual sort of hard intervention. What can I do to really help support my partner, myself through this process, and really any process when we're going through some kind of metabolic change? The thing is that we have to understand that these are things that exist as part of structures that are built a certain way to gatekeep. And that's a very sort of top level way of saying that currently here in the United States, it's very difficult to find practitioners that are going to give you the actual interventions because a lot of it is protected by paywalls and those types of structures to actively continue to find ways to monetize all this human technology. And that's appropriate because we live in a society which is what it is. Ultimately, we're here to advance ourselves whichever way possible. But there is a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of therapy that is kept behind closed doors, is masked behind jargon and hidden behind other types of decorum and process. But ultimately, what we end up coming to, having been in the industry for a while, is most therapists are trained actually in interventions. And when you ask them, what can I do? The reality is a lot of them don't know. CBT, DBT, these are things that you have to pay to get credentialed in. And the reality is that they don't even cover a lot of what the industry would prescribe when trying to help people going through these changes. One of the things I did and that I always look to do is to look internationally to see if there's any models out there that we can help implement here. Part of that has already been done with looking towards Brazil and South America with part of the liberation aspects of what we offer here in providing PrecisionCycle through elevate.epo. But I wanted to also use this opportunity to acknowledge the influence of the Dutch. The Netherlands has been really big in progressive mental health in recent years to break away from that licensure model, the gate-kept model where you have that white coat intervention perspective. You have a client that goes in and they talk to someone who positions themselves as a professional, as an expert, as a doctor. That's what you have here in the United States. When you go to the Netherlands, they have elements of that, but they also have other elements where it's more of a partnership, where it's seen as two people coming together, creating a relationship and understanding the countertransference that occurs in that relationship and how that plays itself out in the field. That's really the model that PrecisionCycle has always looked to bring and adopt. How do we create therapy and therapeutic models that allow for the ability to be collaborators as opposed to the traditional medical model, which ultimately I don't think has yielded a lot of positive results for Americans. And to that point, the thing that the Dutch can really teach us is how to use boundaries as effective mechanisms for creating frameworks in our relationships that protect us, not only from narcissists, but protect our own sanity at times. In America, we still get hung up on words oftentimes. And we treat boundaries oftentimes like trauma itself. As the Dutch, they'll treat boundaries as actual relationship hygiene, something critical to the dynamic between two people who are trying to have relationship, because it gives a very clear boundary, rule of the road of what's the expectation and what will be tolerated and what won't be tolerated. When we look at it from that perspective, we see in this society here in the United States, everyone wants to be liked because of social media and people don't want to be criticized. We often don't want to engage in those boundaries because it oftentimes leads to people separating. It triggers our own abandonment. But the reality is that the boundary itself is your biggest tool towards maintaining your frame so that your field stays consistent and doesn't become intolerable. And so today we're going to talk about how cool orange is, all of it, PrecisionCycle, and we're going to really understand the value of boundaries. I was known as the boundary king at residential, and today I stake my claim and plant my flag as the boundary king of Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, podcast world. Boundary kings, Precision Cycle. It's about boundaries. It's about how we build them. It's about how we enforce them. It's about how we use them to help us build the lives we want for ourselves. I'm Enrique. This is Elevate.epo. Let's open it up. And so we come to the understanding that boundaries often fail because we're not able to properly model them. We've already spoken about Lacanian models and what that says about our society when we don't have male presence in a family, and how we don't end up creating the safe spaces to really understand the limits of our personality, our boundary regimes. Then we get into the world where we seek out a clinician to help us recalibrate in a way that will deliver psychoeducation and practice. And we get met with breathing techniques and dear man forms and all kinds of other distraction, as opposed to how do I actually build a boundary? And so you talk about boundaries with people and they start talking about, yeah, boundaries are I just block you on my phone. Or a boundary is I just don't answer the text, or I just turn away and not engage. No, that's not a boundary. That's avoidance. At the end of the day, what you're doing is just putting up the illusion of a boundary, but ultimately that boundary's never been communicated. You'd be surprised how many times people came into residential having never actually placed a real boundary. And when people ask, where do I start? The place where you always start is I statements, right? Nobody likes to be told that doing horrible things. So if you come out and you tell somebody, when you do this, I react this way, people are going to feel attacked and not want to engage. As opposed to, I felt belittled when you said what you did. That then puts a very clear boundary down. I felt X because you did Y. It doesn't matter that you did Y because of X, Y, Z. Regardless of all that, I felt this way. And that was the end result. You can't deny that. And the reality, that boundary now is placed. Every time that you act that way again in the future, understand that is going to make me react this way. That is how we start placing boundaries. And notice how I didn't say anything negative about the other person. I just said, I feel dysregulated. I feel scared. I feel angry. I feel frustrated. I feel unable to control my anger when this happens. And what we're doing there is we're signaling there's a real activation that occurs and I have trouble controlling that, but that's on me to control. But at the very least, I am putting it out there that I am trying to control this as a result of your behavior. That is a boundary. And it's one that ultimately illustrates that I am having to work to regulate due to your action. And because of that kind of thing can't be tolerated, I'm doing too much work here in the relationship. And that's how we start getting into relational equity, when we're able to have those clear discussions and understand that, yes, we're not going to vilify and we're not going to cast aspersions and shame people for the way they behave. But I do want to let you know that your behavior does have a consequence. And that's really where the boundary foundation starts. The thing that modern therapists are trained in is ultimately holding space and not delivering the structure where those boundaries are going to be effectively offloaded onto the client. And so what we ends up happening is the emotional offloading is mistaken for healing oftentimes. We sit there and get rid of all this process. We talk because we have the verbal word salad that we want to get everything out. But then we're not shown how to protect ourselves moving forward. When it happens again, we're right back in the same cycle. This is the thing about how we tie it to perimenopause. The assertiveness often gets labeled as a mood instability. They're just narcissistic. They're being histrionic. They're being borderline right now in their presentation. That's how somebody would say that. And in relationships, you would also probably say it seems a little narcissistic, a little borderline. Absolutely. But we have to understand, just like clinicians have to understand, that we can't just sit there and stay curious about it. We have to keep holding our line. What do I mean by that? I have had a lot of experience where I have had a client sit there and process in front of me a interaction with their partner that leaves them always asking, why do they do this? That is in many ways the same type of dynamic that a psychoanalyst will utilize in their clinical work. Staying curious. Why did they do this? Because in clinical observation, we don't want to make the assumptions for the client. We don't want to really put the words in their mouth. That's one perspective. And we want to see where that goes and ultimately leads them in the field. Absolutely. The curiosity is definitely something that in deep psychoanalysis is a genuine methodology. But the reality is we know why they're doing this, because that question is often answered with because they have a borderline personality, or because they're narcissists, or because they're depressed. Because we know that, we have to hold the line of our boundaries. We know they're going to do this. It becomes a matter of us, because we're the ones that have to ultimately decide if we're going to interact with them or not, to hold the line and to establish the frameworks, both internally and externally, that we're going to communicate so that we understand that this is how we operate. This is how we protect ourselves. Ultimately, how do we heal relationships is through boundaries and relationships. And if you can't maintain a boundary, then you don't know therapy. That's really the thing I want people to take away from that, because you're playing in containment cosplay. At the end of the day, if you're not teaching people to take this experience that they just had, reframe it, and ultimately apply a corrective, you're doing a disservice. What do the Dutch ultimately bring to the table here in our analysis, and how can the Netherlands tell us a lot about how we should structure mental health system moving forward? The Dutch, to begin with, have always been really great, progressive, advanced society, which values human technology and efficiency. The thing that we really have to understand first and foremost is that directness they offer just in the language itself. That's clarity. That's not cruelty. They are doing people favors by being direct and telling them exactly what they mean. Because here's the thing, in the United States, we have this epidemic going on where a lot of people are ultimately immature. We like to call them narcissists, borderlines, but what we're really saying is people need to grow up and find ways, gain resiliency, and hold containment. We oftentimes assume people are more intellectually advanced than they are. The directness oftentimes helps cut through primitive defenses, which oftentimes protect against cognitive dissonance. And that is something that as a society, the Dutch have really figured out is a very efficient way of communicating intent. Because once you're able to really just have the other person recognize the words that are coming to your mouth, this goes to what Paulo Freire was saying in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, giving people the language and letting them understand the context. That is how you free people from their oppression. So yes, absolutely, freeing us from the fake decorum of society of having to always use euphemisms rather than directly challenging. That is one way we can really start to change the way mental health is practiced, because that's really where we're getting to, a post-therapy model. And that is where PrecisionCycle really has its value proposition, is in that post-therapy model where you've done the therapy and now you actually have to do the work. Emotional boundaries are culturally expected. In the Netherlands, they're not therapeutically achieved. Saying no is normal. Withholding is strategic. It's not repressive. And they don't do it to be mean. They do it to ultimately be respectful of themselves and the other person. Boundaries are not explained. They are implemented. Ultimately, that is really the model that we should walk away with. Because here in the United States, I don't need to sit here and explain why my boundary exists. It should just speak for itself. When we get into this back and forth, that is a sign of the narcissists. And that is a manipulation that starts coming in. And that's really what, as a society, the Dutch have really started to push back against. It's this idea that they have to over-explain themselves when it is just what it is, right? It's my way or the highway, but I'm respectfully putting it that way because ultimately I'm the one that has to navigate this world. But I want to do it in a very respectful manner. So what are some examples here, just from a boundary perspective on the ethics of the Dutch? And if you think about Dutch thinkers like Hans Israel's doing the name justice here, and have long understood what American therapy still can metabolize, which is containment is structure. It's not suppression. Thinkers like Verhaeghe from Belgium shows the psychologizing systemic disconnect. It writes a lot about that dynamic. When we look at Dutch psychoanalyst Jaap van Hoek, he once wrote that containment is not the absence of expression, it's the architecture of permission. Another word for boundary. And that line itself stuck with me because in American therapy, containment is often mistaken for repression. I felt this very viscerally with my own supervision. But Van Hoek was speaking from a cultural context where boundaries weren't negotiated, they're assumed, as opposed to here where boundaries are still novel and things that a lot of practitioners still don't like to terrain that they don't like to travel into. I recently sent a mass email to certain folk. Some of them were my past colleagues at my previous psychoanalytic training center. I noticed that 5 of them clicked through and they very graciously gave me that piece of data. They did click through to the link in the email provided, which was great. But then after they spent time on that site, they summarily blocked me from any type of future emails. That is great. Boundary. Interesting enough, though, as we link that to containment is not the absence of expression, it's the architecture of permission and how that ultimately is misrepresented here in the United States. My supervision was with someone who practiced field theory, and their ultimate issue with the way that I practice and ultimately have developed PrecisionCycle is that it didn't recognize the resistance. It didn't recognize that the boundary the client was putting up oftentimes was not resistance, but actually their healthy recalibration in real time to therapy itself. I was holding space. I was providing them with the tools they needed to craft boundaries, and they were coming in and behaving in ways that made me react a certain way, which then allowed them to implement that boundary and practice it, and really gave them that autonomy and the power, confidence to be able to utilize that. That was seen as something contra to therapy because it didn't treat that as abandonment. The reality is that this is simply a holding space where we don't challenge people to really look at their distortions. We are ultimately here to just listen to them and hold the space and potentially reframe their thoughts into something that's a little bit more cohesively present. That, in many ways, is the model the Dutch rejected a long time ago. The reality in the Netherlands, when you say, I'm not available to hold that right now, whatever, that is a rupture in the relationship as a field theorist would see it. That is etiquette. That is practice. That is actually doing the thing that we talk about all the time. And that's the way that it should look, except that we have to sit here and really play with the calculus of, do we really want boundaries, or are we just being performative about it? Because here's the thing about the Dutch, they don't embrace that trauma lifestyle. They don't embrace the labels that gives you. They move past that. The healing is in finding their own power. Where Americans tend to over-explain, the Dutch just disengage. That's not emotional avoidance, it's containment discipline. And really, that's the model I'm hoping we can bring to the United States in this post-therapeutic world. Therapy itself differentiating. There's a place for therapy, and it's for that person that's in that position where they just need to totally vent and get rid of all this negative affect. After that, though, how do we pick ourselves up? How do we recalibrate? How do we go through the reps, through the motions to give us the work so that we can do this ourselves, so that we're not collapsing and we're not dependent on others to handle the things that are difficult for us to handle? We need to bring it back to boundaries or structural integrity to any personality. McWilliams herself writes that you need to anchor ego boundaries to healthy narcissism. That's the good narcissism. That exists because we as human beings have to fulfill those aspects of our personality which have desires, which has needs. And those are the things that ultimately engage in a healthy manner that help develop us into better people. This itself is that development of boundaries. You are engaging in healthy narcissism, and you're actually fighting your own narcissism when you are aware of the fact that it's challenging your people pleasing, because your people pleasing is narcissism. You're not people pleasing to people please. You're people pleasing to feel better about yourself. Once we disabuse ourselves of that distortion, we get to the realization that actually creating frameworks and boundaries, that is healthy narcissism, and letting people figure it out, because that then makes them respect boundaries, and thus that relational effect. Boundaries shouldn't be a wall. They're an architecture for energy distribution. If anything, they should be used as personal assistants in many ways, for you to understand who's calling at what time, sales funnels, marketing channels, whatever you want to look at them. That's the way that we should look at boundaries. You have a strategy for YouTube, you have a strategy for Instagram, you have a strategy for TikTok. Boundaries should work in the same way. You have a strategy for your parents, you have a strategy for your sisters, your brothers, you have a strategy for people you're intimate with. And as those people start to come in orbit, they then are able to create the communication lanes you have set up in these frameworks. That's that efficiency model that helps us better relate to people, because then I know exactly how I need to show up for one person as opposed to how I need to show up for another person. These are boundaries. These are the set of preferences. This is why we are able to save our settings, our EQ levels on Spotify and Apple Music, is because these are the preferences for how we like things, and the relationship should be no different. And as we have this midlife transition, both female and their partners, especially through perimenopause, and these transitions, these life changes that we go through, as we go through those Ericksonian, Rogerian changes, they require a resorting of who gets access and when to us, because time is ultimately not our friend. As we age and we begin to get to these places where biology starts to really catch up with us. The client who no longer wants emotional babysitting, the client who no longer wants emotionally babysit their friend or partner, but feels guilty for not explaining it gently. The guilt we feel enforcing boundaries is the residue of a life spent managing other people's fragility. I want you to remember that. At the end of the day, it's hard to not do it gently, because we understand that the other person is so fragile that anything we say to them could potentially break them. That is ultimately not your responsibility. That is a responsibility of the person who is dysregulated. We have to stop living our lives in a way where we're managing their fragility, because they have to come to a realization that at some point they have to own it for themselves. So here are the key takeaways. How PrecisionCycle measures boundaries. There's therapy, there's coaching, there's Elevate.epo and PrecisionCycle. What is it exactly that we do? Are we therapists? No. Are we coaches? No. What do you do? I'm the boundary king. I'm a guy who was in corporate America for a bunch of years, left to raise his kids, became an expert in human development. I'm a human engineer. I'm somebody who understands how you work and then looks to fix you and change you. How do we do that? We use data. We don't pathologize. We look at the situation, we look at how you present, and we utilize that as data to draw conclusions. From those conclusions, we understand your level of containment. It tracks your emotional leakage. If you're leaking all over the place, of course you're going to be breaking down. It tracks projection awareness, disarming guilt narratives, right? It teaches us to understand when we're projecting so that we don't say the evil thing and feel bad about it. What else in PrecisionCycle measure? Alignment, execution, alignment, enforcing values with behavior. This is observable, trackable, coachable. The Dutch culture teaches boundaries intuitively. PrecisionCycle measures them systemically. I just gave you those three highlights. Specifically, we look at emotional calibration. That's the ability to accurately name, differentiate, and locate one emotional state. We track that. We can track that weekly. Execution alignment. the degree to which your stated values, intent, identity, and goals align with your actual behavior and decision making, especially under emotional pressure. We track that too, delivered to you weekly as a statistic, as a number that shows you movement. Projection awareness, the capacity to detect when you're externalizing internal conflict onto others. We can track that. We can show you when you're projecting. Again, containment, the ability to hold emotional charge. We can show you where you're leaking, where there's areas that you need to shore up your personality because it's affecting you in this place. Narcissism tracking score and real time, covert narcissistic patterns, guilt traps, weaponized care, martyrdom. We can measure all of that from your words, and we keep track of that weekly. Structural grief integration. This is the ability to metabolize loss, not just of people, but of roles, illusions, protection, and versions of yourself. Again, we measure this, we track it, we can give you a score, a bar graph, all delivered to an app on your phone that shows you weekly movement. Highlights from your session, this is what you get. Finally, erotic containment. That's the big one. The capacity to hold relational charge, polarity, and attraction, especially key during perimenopause. We track this. We show you movement. We show you that we're delivering the psychoeducation, and then you're delivering on the productive output to really get these skills to become part of your personality, integrate them into who you are. And we can measure how fast, how effectively you're doing that. This isn't abstract. This isn't some theory. These are hard numbers, data that I challenge any mental health professional right now to challenge, produce a challenge to, and what benefit traditional therapeutic models has over PrecisionCycle, which can deliver to you these 7 dimensions quantitatively. Because here's the thing about quantitative data. If you can quantify it, you can make it predictive. And if you can make it predictive, you can have true control over it. This isn't like the fake control you think you have when you do something, you don't do something, or you withhold your food, or turn to some kind of other substance. This is the type of real control real human operators in their field utilize, because it shows how contained you are. It shows how mature you are, how regulated you are, how integrated you are, and ultimately how much more potentially successful you'll be over someone who's not. We can command tension. You can lead with clarity. You don't chase. You magnetize. You don't overshare. You signal. So if you're close to someone in midlife recalibration, maybe they're going to perimenopause, maybe they're going through a life change, they just have to transition a career, your role isn't to comfort them, and it's certainly not to collapse into them. Don't ask for emotional access because you used to have it. And you have to ultimately respect the shift in the symbolic gravity when you're dealing with utilizing boundaries. How is PrecisionCycle different? How do we ultimately support field recalibration? This is easy. If you're close to someone in midlife recalibration, your role isn't to comfort them. It's not even to collapse into them. It's just to hold frame. Be that steady voice. Be the person who presents to them that calm energy that doesn't amplify their fear and doesn't punish them for having it. Don't ask for emotional access because you used to have. Understand that they are going through a shift and things have changed. And now it's your job as a partner or someone who's there to support to find another way in to her safety zone. And again, with that, we have to respect the shift of symbolic gravity. Understand that they're going through a process where this idea of themselves, of who they were for the better part of half their life, is now transitioning into this other version. That's a very difficult thing to balance. And the more that we're able to respect that change and not pathologize it, not weaponize it, and certainly not punish it, is going to ultimately help recalibrate that field a lot easier than us trying to always indirectly, passive aggressively communicate our discomfort with the change. When someone you love starts holding the field, don't panic. They've stopped bleeding energy into people who never held them. It's a good thing. The change is always good. The American mental health landscape could benefit from a new cultural standard. The Dutch give us that standard: boundary clarity as emotional fluency. We need to stop treating firm people as broken people and understand that they are probably the most healthy versions of humans, because the direct nature of communication is ultimately the goal. Adopt the works from the Dutch containment culture and implement it into your own field. PrecisionCycle, we're already doing that. You personally listening to this, watching this right now, you should probably do this too. Look to create those direct boundaries so that you can implement them and you can start changing your field directly. Boundaries are not rejection. They are invitations to integrity. If you can read them, the problem isn't the person. It's your fluency. Boundaries aren't rejection. They are invitations to integrity. If you can't read them, the problem isn't the other person. It's your fluency and your ability to understand what is being transmitted. If anything said today resonated with you, please feel free to reach out. If you are a Dutch psychoanalyst in training and practice and would like to contact and have further discussion, please feel free. Enrique at elevateepo.com, elevate.epo on Instagram, Facebook, elevateepo on Twitter. I think this is a great discussion, a great opportunity to really invite different perspectives and look to our neighbors in Europe to see how progressive mental health is challenging outcomes and ultimately really leading to the types of societies, which ultimately I think is what we want. Societies that can really communicate their needs and have them met in ways that adds qualitative positivity to their lives and lessens the opaque nature of passive aggressiveness. Again, my name is Enrique. Thank you again very much. Been a great pleasure to speak to you. The more we can learn from our Dutch psychoanalyst brethren, the more that we'll be able to potentially. As we bring this home, we understand that boundaries are the ways in which we can very much support people going through their current life phases and journeys. Reaching out and looking at the Dutch for the model, I think, is the right one. And I'd love to be able to have an opportunity to collaborate with a Dutch psychoanalyst or student to be able to speak further about this and see how we can work together to bring America into that progressive lens of boundaries and directness and really help change the conversation away from holding spaces to recalibration. We'll be back on Friday when we bring this all home. It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much. Please be safe and bye.